I never gave much thought to what happens after we die. It wasn't that I dismissed the concept of an afterlife, I simply believed it wasn't something worth stressing over. Good people go to heaven, bad people go to hell. That's how I saw it. I didn't really ponder what that meant, or whether it was true. Life was busy, and I didn't want to waste time on matters that didn't seem urgent. I considered myself an average person. Nothing remarkable, nothing particularly bad. I had a decent job, a small circle of friends, and I lived much like everyone else. Working, paying bills, and planning for the future. I wasn't very religious, but I didn't oppose it either. If others wanted to believe in something, that was their choice. It just didn't matter much to me. Reflecting on it now, I realize how much I took for granted. I thought I had endless time to figure things out until everything changed. It started like any other day. I woke up, went to work, took care of my usual tasks, and didn't think about anything too deep. I had no idea that it would turn out to be my last day alive, that I wouldn't make it to the next morning. I wasn't ill, and I wasn't anticipating anything bad happening. That's the thing about death. It's always unexpected. I remember leaving work, getting into my car, and starting the drive home. My thoughts were on ordinary things, what I'd eat for dinner, what show I might watch before bed, and a few errands I needed to run over the weekend. Nothing important. Then, out of nowhere, a sharp pain pierced my chest. It wasn't like regular pain, not a muscle strain or cramp. It felt deep, as if something inside had broken. My arms grew weak, my head spun, and my vision blurred for a moment before everything went black. I don't recall the crash, nor the exact moment I died, but I remember what happened next. I opened my eyes, but I wasn't in my body. I was above it. At first, I couldn't comprehend what I was seeing. A car crash, one that looked severe. People were rushing toward it, shouting. I saw the twisted metal, the shattered glass, the mangled hood of my car. There was another car nearby, and the driver had stepped out in shock, holding their phone, probably calling 911. And then, I saw myself. I was slumped motionless in the driver's seat, blood on my forehead, chest barely rising. I should have felt panic, confusion, fear. But I didn't. I just observed, detached, as though I were watching a film. Soon, paramedics arrived. They rushed to my car, pulled open the door, and began checking my pulse, shouting out numbers and orders. One of them started chest compressions while another retrieved medical tools. They were fighting to save me, but deep down I knew I wasn't coming back, at least not yet. I wasn't in pain and I wasn't scared, but I was confused. I knew I had died, yet somehow I was still there, still aware, still thinking. This wasn't what I had imagined death to be. I always thought that once you die, that's the end. Either you move on to an afterlife, or you simply cease to exist. But I was still there, floating above it all, watching. Before I could make sense of it, something changed. I felt a pull, as if something was drawing me away from the scene. Not physically, but in a way that I couldn't resist. The world around me began to fade. The voices, the sirens, the flashing lights, all disappeared. I was being taken somewhere. For the first time, I felt fear. This wasn't a dream. I turned my head, trying to see where I was headed, but there was nothing. No ground beneath me, no sky above me. Just darkness stretching in all directions. I tried to speak, but no sound came. Then, in the distance, I saw a light. At first, it was just a faint glow, but as I moved closer, it grew larger, warmer. It wasn't just light, it was something more, something alive. I felt an odd sensation, as if I was being drawn to it, but there was something else too, something dark, heavy. Whispers I couldn't quite make out filled the air. They didn't come from the light, but from the shadows around me. A chill ran through me. I tried to turn away, but I couldn't. The whispers grew louder. And then I saw them. Dark figures, barely visible, moving through the shadows, watching me, surrounding me. I knew they weren't human, though I can't explain how. They weren't just observing, they were waiting. A sinking feeling filled my chest. I didn't know where I was, but one thing was clear. I wasn't supposed to be there. Panic began to rise within me, but before I could react, the light before me erupted. A force so powerful, it shattered the darkness in an instant. The dark figures shrieked and vanished like smoke, and the whispers ceased. The fear evaporated, and I felt an overwhelming sense of peace. The light had become something greater, something beyond anything I had ever experienced. And then I heard it. A voice, strong but gentle, powerful yet full of love. "Do not be afraid." I recognized that voice, even though I had never truly thought much about him, even though I had spent my life indifferent to religion. I knew who was speaking to me. It was Jesus. In that moment, I realized something that shook me to my core. I had never truly believed in him, not in any real way, but he had always known me, and now he was here, waiting. I wasn't dead, not yet. I had been given a chance, but a chance for what? I didn't have time to think. The light grew even brighter, and I felt myself moving forward, not by my own will, but by something beyond my understanding. I had no idea what was coming, but I knew one thing. Nothing would ever be the same again. I was drifting, the world around me gone. The accident, the paramedics, the sounds of people shouting, all of it vanished, replaced by nothingness. At first, I thought maybe this was it. Maybe this was what death felt like. Silence. But I was still aware. I could think, feel. I wasn't just floating. I was being pulled. I couldn't see anything at first, just blackness stretching in all directions. It felt like I had been dropped into an endless void, with no sense of up or down. No walls, no edges. I had no body, but I existed. I should have felt calm, maybe even at peace, but I didn't. Something was wrong. The weightless sensation was changing. The silence wasn't truly silent. The darkness wasn't empty. I didn't know how, but I could sense something moving within the void, watching, waiting. Then the whispers came. At first, they were faint, just overlapping murmurs. I tried to make out the words, but they were too jumbled. But the longer I listened, the clearer they became. "You don't belong here. It's too late. No one is waiting for you." A chill swept through me. I tried to move, to look around, but I couldn't. It was as though I was trapped in this endless space, helpless. The whispers grew louder, coming from every direction, closing in. And then, I felt it. Something touching me. It wasn't physical, but it was real. A cold, heavy presence pressing against me from all sides. It wasn't pulling me in any direction. It was simply holding me there. I struggled against it, trying to resist, but I had no control. I wasn't strong enough. I had never been religious, but suddenly I needed something, anything, to escape. Then, out of nowhere, I saw it. A flicker of light. It was distant, barely visible against the crushing darkness, but it was there. A tiny glowing presence moving toward me. The moment I saw it, the whispers changed. They became frantic, angry. "No, don't go. You belong to us. You are nothing." Fear gripped my chest. I didn't know what this light was, but the darkness hated it, and that was enough to tell me one thing. I had to reach it. I didn't know how, but I willed myself forward. The darkness fought to hold me back, but the light was drawing nearer. As it approached, I saw something else. The light wasn't just a glow. It wasn't just energy or brightness. It was someone. A figure stepped out of the light, walking toward me with absolute authority. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. I knew who he was. It was Jesus. The whispers around me screamed in rage. The darkness around me seemed to tremble, as though it were being torn apart. And then, with a single step, Jesus shattered everything. The void collapsed. The whispers vanished. The weight disappeared. I was no longer floating. I was standing. The world around me had changed. No more darkness, no more fear. Just light, brighter than anything I had ever seen. But it didn't hurt my eyes. It was warm, filling me with a peace so deep, it was almost overwhelming. I took a shaky breath, staring at the figure in front of me. Jesus was real, and I had no idea what would happen next. I stood there, frozen. The warmth surrounding me wasn't just heat. It was alive. It wasn't the light I had known on Earth. This wasn't sunlight or the glow of a lamp or a fire. This was something far more profound. It surrounded me, filled me, moved through me like waves of pure peace. For the first time in my life, I felt complete. All the fear, the doubts, the pain, and regrets, they were gone. But the peace wasn't all that was here. I could feel him before I even saw him. A presence stronger than anything I had ever imagined, powerful, yet holy. And then, I saw him, standing just a few feet in front of me. Jesus, there was no mistaking him. His presence was overwhelming, radiating authority, but not in a way that frightened me. It wasn't like a king or a judge pronouncing judgment. It was love, but also undeniable power. I had never really imagined Jesus before, aside from paintings, but none of them came close to this. He wasn't just a man. He wasn't merely glowing. He was the light. The light emanated from him, flowing in all directions, filling every inch of the space. It wasn't just bright. It was alive. It carried something deeper than sight, something true. When I looked into his eyes, I knew he saw everything, every lie, every selfish act, every time I had put my own comfort before doing the right thing, every moment I had doubted or turned away from God. And yet, he wasn't condemning me. I thought I would feel ashamed, small, but all I felt was love. A love so intense, it made my chest ache. It was almost overwhelming. It wasn't like human love, conditional, fleeting, or uncertain. This love was pure, unshaken by anything I had done. It was complete acceptance. I couldn't handle it. My knees gave out and I fell to the ground, tears welling up in my eyes. I couldn't even speak. I didn't know what to say. I had spent my life indifferent to God, ignoring faith in Jesus, and yet here I was, kneeling before him. What could I say? He knew everything about me, yet he was still here. Then he spoke my name, not just a sound, but something deeper. It wasn't like hearing a voice. It felt as though his words were engraved in my soul. Daniel. It wasn't a question or a command, but a recognition, like he had always known me, like he had been waiting for me. My whole body trembled. Then he said something that shook me to my core. You have been seeking answers. My breath caught. Seeking? I hadn't been seeking. I had never cared, had I? But then flashes of my life played in my mind. Moments I had ignored, moments I had brushed off. Late at night, staring at the ceiling, wondering if there was more. Conversations I had walked away from when people started talking about God. Times when I had questioned, but never admitted it. I had been seeking. I just hadn't realized it. Jesus stepped closer, and the warmth around me grew even stronger. Now you will see the truth, he said. Suddenly, everything around me shifted. I wasn't standing in the light anymore. I was somewhere else. The ground beneath me felt solid, but not like anything I had ever stood on before. The sky stretched above me, filled with colors I couldn't even name. It was beautiful, but I wasn't alone. Jesus was still there, standing beside me. His presence was unwavering, his gaze fixed forward. Then I saw them, people, countless people, walking, some standing in awe, others kneeling, overwhelmed. I turned to Jesus, confused. Where are we? He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he lifted his hand and gestured toward the people. Watch, he said. I looked and saw people who looked like me and others who didn't. People of all races, backgrounds, all in the same place. Some were walking toward the light, toward peace, toward him. Others weren't. Burn, I thought. I looked back at Jesus. Where do white people go? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he asked me a question. Where do you think? I hesitated. Heaven? I said. He tilted his head slightly. Some, he replied. I felt my stomach tighten. And the others? I asked. His expression remained steady. He didn't need to answer. I already knew. They went where all people go, depending on one thing, not their race, their history, or their culture, but their hearts. Jesus turned back toward the people, watching them. There are no divisions here like there were on Earth. No borders, no nationalities, no skin colors. I swallowed hard. Then why do some go one way and others don't? Jesus looked at me, and when he spoke, his words carried weight. Because of their choices. It hit me like a shockwave. The only thing that mattered was what they had chosen, whether they had chosen him, whether they had believed. I looked back at the countless souls before me, realizing something I had never understood before. I had spent my life assuming people's destinies were determined by earthly things, where they came from, what they looked like, or what they were taught. But in this place, none of that mattered. The only thing that mattered was who we chose to follow. I turned back to Jesus, my chest tightening. "So it was never about race?" I asked. He smiled gently. "It was always about the heart." Suddenly, everything made sense. I looked around, trying to process what I was seeing. The vastness of this place was beyond anything I could understand. It wasn't just one space. It was layered, stretching in different directions, like there were realms within realms. Some areas radiated light, peace, and joy, while others felt distant, filled with something heavier, something I didn't want to get close to. I turned to Jesus, the only steady presence in all of this. He stood beside me, calm and unmoving, as if none of what I was witnessing was new to him. "Where are we?" I finally asked. He didn't answer immediately. Instead, he motioned with his hand, and suddenly, my vision expanded. I saw thousands, no millions of people, some in small groups, others standing alone, all spread out across this endless space. But something was off. I scanned the faces, searching for a pattern, something familiar that made sense. Then it hit me. I could see every race, every culture, every nationality, but there were no divisions. There were no separate areas for different people. No spaces for white people, black people, Hispanic people, Asian people, nothing like that. I turned to Jesus, the question forming in my mind before I even spoke. Where do white people go after they die? I don't know why I asked. Maybe it was because on Earth, race is one of the first things people notice. We separate ourselves, whether we mean to or not, by culture, by language, by history. I expected some kind of answer, maybe that white people had their own place, or that each race had its own destiny. But Jesus didn't hesitate. He simply said, "You see with human eyes, but here, race does not exist." The words hit me like a wave. I looked back at the endless number of souls before me. People were moving, some walking toward the light, others standing still, hesitant, unsure. And some were being pulled away toward something I couldn't see, something hidden in the distance. My chest tightened. Then why do some people go toward the light and others don't? Jesus turned to me. His expression was calm but serious. "It is not about race. It never was. It is about the heart. The heart." I swallowed hard, watching as more people moved. Their faces were filled with either joy or regret. It had nothing to do with where they were born, nothing to do with their ancestors, nothing to do with their skin color. Only one thing mattered: the choices they had made in life. I took a shaky breath. So all this time, people have been focusing on the wrong things. Jesus nodded. "You were not made to be divided by race. That was never my Father's design. That was the world's design." The weight of his words sank deep into my mind. On Earth, race defines so much. It determines how people are treated, how they see themselves, how history remembers them. But here, it meant nothing. People weren't separated by their earthly identities. They were separated by the condition of their souls. I looked toward the group, moving toward the light. Faces filled with peace. Then my eyes shifted to those who weren't moving, people standing still, some looking around in confusion, others staring at the light but not stepping toward it. And then, those who were slowly drifting backward, as if being pulled away by something unseen. My throat tightened. "And the ones who don't go to the light?" Jesus' voice was gentle but firm. "They chose to reject it." A knot formed in my stomach. but some of them look like good people. Jesus turned to me, his expression filled with sorrow. Being good is not the same as knowing me. The word struck me like lightning. I had always thought being a good person was enough, that if someone lived a decent life, didn't hurt others, and tried to do the right thing, they would be fine. But here, in this place, that wasn't the measure. I watched as some people hesitated, standing between the light and the darkness. They looked torn, as if some part of them wanted to move forward, but something else was holding them back. I looked at Jesus, my voice barely above a whisper. Why don't they go? Jesus looked at them too, because they never truly knew me. I felt my entire body tense. It wasn't about race. It wasn't about background. It wasn't about how good someone was by human standards. It was about knowing him. I swallowed hard. So white people don't go to a specific place? No one does. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with love, but also with deep, unshakable truth. When you leave the world, your identity is no longer in your race, your nation, or your status. Your only identity is in me. I could barely breathe. Everything I had thought I understood about life, about death, about who we are, was being completely rewritten before my eyes. I looked back at the souls moving toward the light. I could see who they truly were now, not as white, black, Hispanic, or any other earthly label. They were souls. And I realized something chilling. Every single person here had already made their choice before they died. There were no second chances after this. The people moving toward the light had already chosen to follow God while they were alive. The ones standing still had spent their lives ignoring him, waiting until it was too late. And the ones being pulled away had rejected him completely. A sinking feeling formed in my chest. It was never about race. It was about Jesus. And suddenly, I knew if I had died without knowing him, without choosing him, I wouldn't be standing here right now. I would have been pulled away, just like the others. I turned back to Jesus, my voice shaking. Then what happens next? Jesus looked at me, his gaze filled with something I couldn't quite describe. Now you must see what happens when a soul is lost. And in an instant, the light around me shifted, and I saw something that made my entire body go cold. I stood there, heart pounding, as Jesus turned toward me. The light around him didn't just glow, it moved like waves of living energy, radiating warmth, truth, and something far beyond human understanding. But as I looked past him, I saw something else. A rift, a division, not physical, but spiritual. On one side, I saw people, countless souls standing in the light, their faces filled with peace. Some were embracing each other. Some were kneeling, overwhelmed by God's presence. Others were simply rejoicing, as if they had finally arrived home. But on the other side, the scene was completely different. Darkness stretched out like a fog, thick and heavy. Within it, I saw figures, people, but not as I had ever seen them before. Their faces were twisted, filled with regret. Some stood in shock. Others covered their faces, unable to bear the sight of what surrounded them. Some reached toward the light, but it was as though they couldn't move forward, as if an invisible barrier was keeping them away. My chest tightened. I turned to Jesus, desperate for an explanation. What am I looking at? His voice was calm and filled with complete assurance about the truth regarding judgment. I took a deep breath, trying to grasp it. I had always thought I understood judgment, believing it was based on whether someone was a good or bad person. But what I was witnessing now was far more complex than that. I asked, "Why are they separated?" Jesus looked directly at me and replied, "Because their choices have already been made." A tight feeling formed in my stomach. "What choices?" I asked. "Not the ones you think," Jesus responded. And in that moment, I had visions, flashes of life on earth. I saw people feeding the hungry, helping others, living with kindness. Then I saw something else. Those who lived selfishly, caused harm, or rejected truth. But then, something that truly shocked me appeared. People I had known. Friends, family, co-workers. Some were standing in the light, others were not. My chest tightened. "I don't understand," I said. Some of these people were good. They didn't hurt anyone. They lived decent lives. Why are they in darkness? Jesus met my gaze, his face filled with both sorrow and love. Because they rejected me. But they weren't bad people, I said. Some even believed in God. Jesus nodded. Many believed in God, but they never truly knew me. A sinking feeling spread through me. I had always believed that as long as someone was good, they would be fine. That heaven was for those who lived decent lives, treated others well, and avoided serious wrongs. But now everything was different. It wasn't about how good they were. It was about who they followed. I looked again at the souls in the darkness. Some of them appeared shocked, as if they hadn't expected to be there. Others seemed angry, defiant even, unwilling to accept their fate. I turned to Jesus, my voice barely a whisper. What happens to them? His face showed deep sorrow, yet there was also justice in his eyes. They remain where they chose to be. I felt my stomach drop. Chose? They chose this, I asked, shaking my head. Who would choose this? Jesus held my gaze. They chose a life without me, and now they have eternity without me. My entire body tensed. I had spent my life assuming that heaven and hell depended on behavior, that if you were good, you'd go to heaven, and if you were bad, you wouldn't. But now, the truth was clear. People didn't end up in darkness because they weren't good enough. They ended up there because they had lived without Jesus, and now they would spend eternity without him. I turned back to the souls in the light. They weren't all people who lived perfect lives. Many had made mistakes, failed or fallen short, but they knew him. They believed in him, followed him, and gave their hearts to him. And that was all that mattered. I faced Jesus again, my throat dry. What about people who never had the chance to know you? I asked. People who were raised differently, who weren't taught about you. Jesus looked at me, and when he spoke, his words held absolute authority. Everyone is given a chance. No one is without excuse. I felt my heart race. Everyone? I asked. Somewhere in their lives, every person was given the chance to seek him, to hear him, to choose him. Some ignored it, some denied him outright. Others followed their own versions of truth, refusing the real truth. And now, they are lost. I turned back to the people in the darkness. The regret on their faces was unbearable to witness. Some of them looked desperate, wishing they could go back and change their choice, but they couldn't. Their time had passed. My knees felt weak. This is real, I asked. Jesus nodded. More real than anything you've ever known. A thought hit me hard. If I died without knowing you. Jesus didn't answer, but I knew. I knew that if I had died, I wouldn't be in the light. I would be in the darkness. The truth sank deep into my soul. Everything I had thought was important. Race, nationality, culture. None of it mattered. The only thing that mattered was Jesus. Jesus turned to me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't describe. Now you must see what happens to those who refuse their last chance. In an instant, I was somewhere else. My mind raced, trying to process everything I had just witnessed. The souls, the light, the darkness, the truth about life after death. It wasn't a dream, it wasn't a hallucination. It was the ultimate reality. And now, Jesus was looking at me with an expression so full of love and authority that I could barely hold his gaze. I knew what was coming next. My time here was ending, but there was still one question. Would I stay or go back? I felt torn, caught between two desires. Part of me wanted to stay, to remain in this peace, in this presence, in this love, unlike anything on earth. There was no pain, no stress, no confusion, just truth. But then I saw something. A vision. I looked down at a hospital room. I saw a bed, a body lying still, lifeless, my body. Beside me were my wife and kids, crying. Their faces were filled with a pain I could feel even from here. My wife's hands trembled as she held mine, whispering my name over and over, begging me to come back. My son, who had always looked up to me, had his head buried in his hands. My daughter, barely old enough to understand, clung to my arm as if holding on to me could bring me back. I couldn't breathe. This was real. It was happening. I turned to Jesus, my heart pounding. "They need me," I said. Jesus nodded, his voice calm but firm. "Yes, but they need more than you." I swallowed, my throat dry. "What do you mean?" Jesus stepped closer. "They need the truth." The weight of his words hit me like a shockwave. "The truth," I repeated. "Not just about life, not just about death, but about him." Before this moment, I hadn't truly known the truth. I had lived my life believing that people went to heaven or hell based on how good or bad they were. I hadn't realized it was about who we chose to follow, who we gave our hearts to. I had almost missed it. I felt my hands shaking as I turned back to the hospital room. My wife was sobbing against my chest, my children lost and hopeless. They didn't just need me, they needed the truth I had just discovered. They needed to know that this life wasn't the end, that what happens after death is real, and that Jesus wasn't just a concept or a religion. He was everything. I turned back to Jesus. "If I go back, will they believe me?" I asked. His gaze didn't waver. "That is not your burden to carry." I felt my stomach twist. I already knew what he meant. Some would believe, some wouldn't. Some would listen but ignore it, others would mock it. But that wasn't the point. The point was to tell them anyway. Jesus extended his hand. "Will you tell them the truth?" I stared at him, at everything I had just learned, at the countless souls who had waited too long to believe, at my family who needed answers they didn't even know existed. I felt tears building in my eyes. I took a shaky breath and said the only word that mattered. "Yes." The moment I spoke, everything shifted. The light around me faded. Jesus' presence didn't disappear, but I felt myself being pulled backward, like I was being ripped from this realm. The warmth, the peace, the overwhelming love, all of it started to blur. I gasped, feeling myself fall, spinning, then pain, deep, heavy pain in my chest. I gasped for air, my body convulsing as my lungs filled with air, for the first time since I had died. I was back. I could hear machines beeping. I could feel my wife's hand clutching mine. I could hear whispers of my name. I was alive. I had returned, but I wasn't the same. I had seen what happens after death. I had spoken to Jesus, and now I had a mission. I gasped for air. It felt like I had been ripped from something, forced back into my body with such force that it sent a shockwave through me. My chest burned, every nerve screamed, as if I had been jolted away from something far beyond sleep. I could hear voices, distant at first, then sharper, clearer. "He's breathing," someone said. "My God, he's back!" A crushing weight settled on my chest, but it wasn't fear. It was my wife, her arms wrapped around me, her body shaking as she sobbed against my shoulder. "Daniel, oh my God, Daniel!" I tried to speak, but my throat was dry, my body weak. I could barely move. My fingers twitched against the hospital bed, feeling the cool sheets beneath me. I was here. I was alive. But I wasn't the same. The beeping of machines filled the room. A doctor stood over me, wide-eyed, his expression a mix of shock and disbelief. You were gone," he muttered. "We lost you for several minutes." I tried to process what he was saying, but my mind was still trapped in what I had just seen. Jesus, the light, the souls in darkness, the truth. It wasn't a dream. It wasn't some hallucination caused by lack of oxygen. I had been there. I had seen what happens after death. And now I was back, not because I wanted to be, but because I had a mission. My wife's grip on my hand tightened. Her eyes were swollen with tears as she searched my face. "Daniel, what happened? What did you see?" I swallowed hard, my throat aching. I wanted to tell her everything, but how could I explain something so unbelievable? The doctor stepped forward, shining a light in my eyes, checking my vitals, muttering medical explanations. "This is remarkable," he said. "You were clinically dead, no pulse, no brain activity, and now you're here. This doesn't happen." I knew why it happened. Because Jesus sent me back. I closed my eyes, trying to steady my thoughts, but the images were burned into my mind. The souls, the choice, the way I had almost been one of the lost. I turned to my wife, my voice hoarse. I saw him. She frowned. Who? I took a deep breath. Jesus. The room fell silent. The doctor's expression changed, like he had heard this before, like he had seen other patients wake up talking about strange visions. His face became careful, measured. You've been through a lot, he said slowly, his tone clinical. When the brain lacks oxygen, it can create all sorts of experiences, dreams, hallucinations. No, I shook my head. This was real. My wife looked at me, uncertain. Daniel. I saw him. I repeated, my voice now stronger. I asked him where people go after they die. Do you know what he said? She hesitated. I swallowed, my throat dry. He said it's not about that. Her brow furrowed. Not about what? It's not about race, I said. It's not about nationality. It's not about how good we were or how we saw ourselves. I shook my head, emotion rising in my chest. It's about who we choose to follow. Silence. No one spoke. The doctor scribbled something on his clipboard. My wife's face was pale, confused. And I knew what was coming next. The doubt, the dismissal, the mocking. The first time I told my story outside that hospital room, I saw skepticism in people's eyes. Some listened out of politeness, nodding, pretending to understand. Others laughed, shaking their heads, writing me off as just another person with a near-death delusion. Even close friends, people I had trusted, told me it was just a dream. Man, your brain was shutting down, that's all. But they were wrong. I hadn't just seen light. I hadn't just felt peace. I had seen souls lost in darkness. I had heard Jesus tell me it was never about race. It was always about the heart. And I had been given a choice to come back and tell the truth. And I wouldn't stay silent. I changed after that. I wasn't the same man who had gone into that hospital. I couldn't go back to my old way of thinking, my old way of living, pretending like none of it had happened. I started telling people everywhere, at work, at church, at the grocery store. Some laughed in my face, others got uncomfortable and changed the subject. But there were those who listened. The ones who leaned in closer, whose eyes filled with tears, because deep down, they knew. Something inside them had been missing. Because the truth is, we all feel it. That nagging question, that uncertainty about what happens when we die. And now I knew. I had seen it, and I would never stop telling people about it. I don't know how many lives I've changed. I don't know if people believe me when I tell them what I saw, but I don't care. Because the truth is the truth, whether people accept it or not. And in the end, when everything is stripped away, our race, our nationality, our success, our failures, only one thing will matter. Not how good we were, not how much money we made, not where we were born, only this. Did we know him? Because when we die, the only thing that matters is if we truly knew him.